Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Terence Roehrig. Now, Terence is a returning guest on this podcast, and previously we spoke about his work on the Korean Northern Limit Line. So today we're going to take a slightly broader look at his research and the work he has done as Professor of National Security Affairs and the Director of the Asian Pacific Studies Group at the US Naval War College. Specifically, today's podcast will center around a particular aspect of a recent book that Terence has published, entitled Japan, South Korea, and the United States Nuclear Umbrella, Deterrence After the Cold War. Now, shortly after the Korean War, America extended its nuclear deterrent to the new South Korean state. And in doing so, it positioned nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula. And the theory behind this deployment, of course, was targeted at North Korea and the attempt to deter a future North Korean attack, just as that which happened in 1950. However, there are also broader reasons for this. South Korea was an insecure state at the time, and then President Sun Min-ree wanted in many ways to finish what the North had started during the Korean War. He wanted to take the Korean peninsula as a whole. And in some ways, the positioning of nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula was a way to placate Rhee, a way to convince him that he didn't need to keep building up his military. He could return his focus to the construction of a strong civilian government. And this became ever more important after the Nixon shocks, when America made announcements to its allies in East Asia that it would be withdrawing much of its combat troops and much of its military infrastructure. And with this retraction of American military presence, a nuclear commitment, a nuclear umbrella, offered reassurances that were seemingly being lost at the time. But throughout this, there were debates inside the US State Department. There were concerns about the positioning of these weapons. They were being used as propaganda inside North Korea, and they were being used as commitments for why the North needed its own nuclear program. Similarly, there was a risk of forward deploying strategic nuclear weapons. In the event of another blitzkrieg invasion, these weapons could be lost to the enemy. So for these and a number of other reasons, in 1991, George H.W. Bush withdrew all tactical nuclear weapons from the Korean peninsula, doing so all along with an eye on North Korea. In a way, calling their bluff, making a statement of sorts that the reason in which you claim you need nuclear weapons has now been withdrawn, it's now being lost, and all the while looking back at South Korea and committing themselves in the same way that they were before. Sure, the nuclear weapons were gone, but the nuclear umbrella would remain. America still had a nuclear deterrent over the South Korean state. And of course, over the years, this has become increasingly important. The North Korean regime has built up its missile technology, and through a series of nuclear tests has developed some sort of nuclear capability. And behind all of this is a lesser reported biological and chemical weapons stockpile. And throughout these years, the reasoning and the logic behind the nuclear deterrent hasn't really changed. It remains as a deterrent to North Korea, a new element in any of their strategic calculations that should make those calculations entirely unacceptable. But this also stretches beyond the military dynamic. There are implicit promises inside America's nuclear commitment here. Certain reassurances to the South Korean state that the Americans are on their side. They are allies, and they are in many ways economically and socially committed to South Korean prosperity. But of course, running through all of this is a series of difficult challenges. There is an international taboo on the use of nuclear weapons. They haven't been used since 1945. So it is incredibly hard to convince a state like North Korea that America are not just able, but also willing to use these weapons and pay the international price that will come with that use. Similarly, an attack on North Korean territory would spark in many ways a regional crisis. By irradiating North Korean geography in this way, China's internal security would be dragged into the scenario, as would South Koreans and as would Japanese. Similarly, the use of nuclear weapons by America in this regard would do tremendous damage to international non-proliferation regimes. So the challenge for America and South Korea begins to build up here. How do they hold on to this deterrent and keep it credible in the face of all these challenges? And just what would they do in the event of a North Korean attack or even a North Korean nuclear attack? These are the questions that I'm going to work through today with Terence Roehrig. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a glimpse into a small aspect of the research of a much larger book that Terence has published, the link to which will be provided below in this podcast. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account or the PayPal link attached below. On that, and to walk us through America's nuclear umbrella and how it relates to the Korean Peninsula, this is Terence Roehrig. Terence Roehrig, welcome back to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you very much, Jed. Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to be speaking through, I suppose, a core aspect of some of your most recent research here. But before we jump into what we're going to speak about today, I might get you to introduce the book in which this comes from, because we're going to be speaking about a very narrow area of research that comes from a much broader book that you have produced. So I might get you to introduce that publication first, if that's okay.
Sure. First, I'd have to offer the usual caveat that these views are my own and do not represent those of the U.S. government, the Navy, or the Department of Defense. And with that said, the book is a broad look at the U.S. nuclear umbrella for Japan and South Korea. And it looks at the history of how the nuclear umbrella has been in place for both countries, how the United States had nuclear weapons in both countries at various times during the Cold War. The process for how these weapons were removed. It also reviews the threat that the nuclear umbrella is addressed at, in particular for Japan, it is China. For the United States, it is largely North Korea, but Japan is also North Korea as well. So I think that's an important element in the book, that it acknowledges a very different threat assessment between Japan and between South Korea. For the Japanese, the Chinese are a much more important long-term strategic challenger. North Korea is the immediate concern, as it is for South Korea as well. Then I also talk about some of the theoretical concepts that underlie deterrence and the nuclear umbrella. And lastly, the overall and central argument of the book is that the United States, I believe, is unlikely to use nuclear weapons to defend Japan and South Korea, despite the offering of the nuclear umbrella. I think that does not mean that the United States will not be there to defend Japan and South Korea. I think the alliances are strong despite some of the concerns recently. The alliances remain strong. They remain important to U.S. interests, and the United States will be there to defend those two allies. But I think it is very unlikely that the United States will use nuclear weapons, and I think the United States should not use nuclear weapons to defend those two allies. Instead, I think the nuclear umbrella is a very important political signal to those two allies of the importance of the alliance, the importance of these relationships. I also think that the nuclear umbrella is a very important non-proliferation tool for the United States. The United States has long been concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, not only to adversaries, but also to allies. And the nuclear umbrella helps to restrain South Korea and Japan from acquiring their own nuclear weapons. And that is another important element of the nuclear umbrella. So again, I think highly unlikely. I think, though, it remains a very important political signal, but is also an important non-proliferation tool for the United States.
And I will be attaching a link to this book in question at the bottom of this podcast, and I recommend people go and read it afterwards, of course. And before we jump into some of the really deep research that you've done here, I think it's probably important that we flush out a few of just the general core theory that comes across here, just so people listening are following along at home. So just as a start, what is a nuclear umbrella as a theory, and how did the American nuclear umbrella come about?
The nuclear umbrella is a part of extended deterrence. When you look at the concept of deterrence, there are two ways to look at this, or two ways to implement it. One certainly is to deter an attack against yourself, what is often referred to as primary deterrence. The other possibility for deterrence is what is known as extended deterrence, where you try to deter an attack on an ally. And the United States has long held, since the end of World War II, an extended deterrence relationship with South Korea and with Japan, where it sought to deter an invasion against these two states or military action against these states. One of the things that I think is important to note here is that many in East Asia will refer to extended deterrence and assume that that means nuclear weapons. But that's not correct. Extended deterrence is a broad effort through a number of different tools to try to deter an attack, deter aggression against an ally. Nuclear weapons may be one part of extended deterrence, but as is clear in the Japan and South Korea case, that it included much more than just nuclear weapons. First of all, there was a mutual defense treaty which indicated U.S. support and a formal defense relationship with these two countries. Secondly, the United States had major aid programs to these allies, which demonstrated again that the United States had important interests at stake in the region. And lastly, the United States has deployed large numbers of troops to South Korea and Japan over the years, although that number has changed, certainly in South Korea. Nuclear weapons was simply a fourth part of that equation that was an effort to reinforce deterrence of these two allies. Now, one of the ideas behind this is twofold, I would say. First, nuclear weapons, the tactical nuclear weapons that were deployed to South Korea and as well Japan, were in part intended to be warfighting tools. That if, say, in the Korean case, that the United States saw that North Korea was again massing troops for some sort of an invasion across the border, that nuclear weapons could be used to disperse that invasion, to be able to hit North Korean troops in the north before they were able to get across. But the theory also argued that nuclear weapons provided a link from conventional forces to the larger strategic nuclear arsenal that the United States had, and so that it provided a range of options for the United States to respond to defend these allies. Now, of course, the circumstances have changed dramatically in Korea. I mean, not only accounting for this past year, but also a recognition that the United States no longer needed nuclear weapons necessarily on the ground in Korea to be able to defend South Korea and as well Japan. And so the nuclear umbrella today is largely a declaratory policy that the United States would consider using nuclear weapons to defend either of these two allies, but nuclear weapons are not present there, and they are not an automatic response to whatever an adversary might decide to do to Japan or South Korea.
And let's talk through for a moment there the idea of credibility here, because as listening to you explain that there, what begins to ping in my ear a little bit is the idea of credibility, the idea that in some ways you have to convince people that this is something that you're willing to use. And of course, as you walk through a few of these things and a few of these scenarios, and as you mentioned earlier, it may be obvious to some people that America would intervene in a conflict and on the Korean Peninsula. It may not be obvious that they would use nuclear weapons. So let's talk us through this idea of credibility for a second, and how a nation goes about proving credibility. Because in a way, I suppose it's something you have to demonstrate. You can't just tell people you're going to do something. People really need to believe it. And then you have this challenge of how you go about doing that.
And that is a very important question. Credibility has long been one of the challenges of deterrence, and certainly nuclear deterrence. And when you are looking at the use of nuclear weapons, how do you demonstrate that you will use nuclear weapons, a weapon that has not been used since 1945, a weapon that would bring tremendous destruction and possibly even the destruction of the countries that you are trying to protect as well as yourself? And yet credibility is a very important part of this. And I think that this is the significant puzzle to me that is part of what this book addresses. That when you look at the circumstances of the nuclear umbrella, that it is, again, highly unlikely that the United States would use nuclear weapons for a number of reasons, which I can talk about later. But that when you look at those circumstances, the leaders in Japan and South Korea must also understand that there is a great credibility challenge for the United States to use nuclear weapons. And yet the leaders of both countries regularly call for assertions that the United States would use nuclear weapons, that the United States would not hesitate to do that, and call for that reassurance on a regular basis. So if the credibility is questionable, why do leaders in these two countries continue to call for assertions of the United States nuclear umbrella? And again, I think it comes to largely the importance of this as a political signal, that it is a demonstration of the U.S. commitment to defend these countries, but not necessarily with nuclear weapons. And there's a quote that I use in the book from a former British defense official, Dennis Healy, who talks about in the European context, he says that it takes 95% assurance to reassure allies about U.S. credibility, but only 5% credibility to actually deter adversaries. In other words, that while allies continue to call for reassertions of the nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence commitments more broadly because of their need for reassurance, an adversary may not necessarily need that much reassurance to know or to be worried that the United States may in fact use a nuclear weapon or use some other means to be able to protect and deter attack against an ally. So even though there are credibility concerns in regards to the United States and its declaration of a nuclear umbrella, adversaries may need far less demonstrations of credibility to think that this is a worrisome enough possibility that they will in fact be deterred despite what an ally may be concerned about.
And so let's push on here into the Korean context. And of course, a lot of these things that we've spoken about already will be flushed out in more detail, and a lot of the other small details that we may have missed over here will come out a lot more as we walk through this. So let's jump into the South Korean context here. And of course, North Korea is what is heavily involved here. But as you mentioned there, the American nuclear umbrella is the idea that America will extend their own nuclear protection, their own nuclear surveillance, their own nuclear grasp over another country. But in the early days of South Korea's nuclear umbrella, they did something that I assume is quite an odd, or at least an aberration inside international relations from the Americans' perspective. They actually deployed these nuclear weapons on the South Korean peninsula.
Yes, and that's not so odd because we still actually have U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Europe that are part of the U.S. nuclear umbrella there. So it's not only about Japan and South Korea. We had nuclear weapons in Okinawa and perhaps one or two other of the island areas in that island chain during much of the Cold War. They were pulled out of Japan in 1972 as part of the process of the reversion of Okinawa back to Japanese sovereignty and control. And so it's not that much of an aberration. They were viewed as a potential warfighting tool to be able to, certainly in the European context, to counter advantages that the Russians had in personnel, that the United States could never match the Red Army with deployments of U.S. soldiers in Europe to deter them. So nuclear weapons were part of that argument. Nuclear weapons, also tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, allowed again for that link that I mentioned earlier to larger U.S. forces. That similar logic was in play in Asia. But as time went on, it became clear in the Korean context that nuclear weapons were a serious problem in regards to the Korean security situation and were eventually withdrawn in 1991.
So let's talk about Sungmin-Rhee, because one of the reasons that, at least from reading through a lot of your research here, one of the reasons that nuclear weapons were placed inside the Korean Peninsula, at least had Sungmin Rhee and the end of the Korean War in mind. The idea that the war was over, and Sungmin Rhee, as much as Kim Il Sung in the north, didn't want it to be over. They still desired to dominate the entire peninsula, and America were trying in some ways to convince Rhee to step back into a more civilian-led style government and reduce his military. And this might have been a way to do it. So I suppose coming through a lot here is this running idea that America are concerned about Sungmin Rhee, and nuclear weapons is a way to, I suppose, placate some of his warmongering.
Sure, it's a very complicated context, and I think also you have to put into play the debate or such between the State Department and the Defense Department over some of this. But when you look at the Syngman Rhee piece, as you know, there were great concerns that Rhee might be willing to restart the Korean War again, to not have it end without being reunified and under his control. And nuclear weapons allowed for a way to perhaps restrain Syngman Rhee, because it meant the war could go nuclear, and that could be a disaster. It was also believed that nuclear weapons would allow for South Korea to have a smaller military, in that Rhee was asking for large amounts of U.S. aid. He wanted a large standing South Korean military, because that, of course, was one of the problems at the start of the Korean War, was that North Korea was given a great deal of weaponry and support by the Russians. And the United States did not match that on the South Korean side for those same fears that Rhee might start the Korean War. So he was given largely defensive weapons, aid that was somewhat limited, etc. So there was certainly a great deal of pressure to reverse that after the Korean War. But again, the United States had just fought World War II, the Korean War, and the United States was not interested in large defense budgets coming into the Eisenhower administrations, and so wanted to have a way to keep U.S. military presence, U.S. military spending reduced, and to not have to provide such large amounts of aid to maintain a large South Korean military. Thus, the nuclear umbrella was also viewed as a way to provide an argument for Rhee to not have to have so many divisions under his leadership. Also, I would add again that there were debates between the state and the Defense Department folks. State Department was very reluctant to deploy nuclear weapons. Coming out of World War II, they believed that these weapons were problematic. To use them again in an Asian context was a problem. Politically, this was just going to be much more trouble than it was worth. But the Pentagon argued for military reasons that tactical nuclear weapons were important to have in Korea, but also I think there were certainly bureaucratic elements going on here, as the Navy and the Air Force were largely given the nuclear mission in the United States. Nuclear weapons in Korea would be an Army show, and so this allowed them to compete bureaucratically with other parts of the military for the nuclear mission. So when you put all of these things together, it became the rationale for deploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in 1958. But I think it's important to note Eisenhower was reluctant as well. He labored over this decision, ultimately decided to deploy them, but he was very reluctant to do so initially.
And of course, there's this strange incident in 1976 inside the DMZ, where I suppose it's now referred to as the axe murder incident or the tree cutting incident, where North Korean soldiers attacked a joint American South Korean trip to try and cut down one of the trees inside the DMZ. And one of the spin-off events of this was these raids. These I suppose these mock missions from Guam up towards the DMZ, towards North Korea, which from all accounts they were deliberately staged to I suppose mimic a nuclear attack. These were nuclear-capable B-52 bombers flying from Guam all the way up into North Korea. And of course, many people listening will have heard, at least in 2017, when Kim Jong-un spent a lot of time talking about how Guam was in his sights and things like this. This, of course, there must be some memory of these moments here. So let's take us to the actual, I suppose, those odd operationalized moments when the umbrella wasn't just there, but it was being shown in a much more visceral way.
Sure. And I think this is really an important connection that you make, that folks have seen over the last few years that during some of the exercises the United States has conducted with South Korea, that we have used assets that are referred to as strategic assets, systems that are nuclear capable, to demonstrate, again, the credibility that you raised earlier in the interview. So these kinds of demonstrations are not new. We have done these a number of times in the past, and they are efforts to try to show the credibility that the nuclear umbrella may have, that the United States might actually use it and have these demonstration effects to it. But I think it's always important to think about, while you are trying to demonstrate credibility, you can also go overboard, and you can conduct actions that actually can verge on being provocative. And I think we always have to be very careful about these sorts of demonstrations, that while you are trying to demonstrate credibility, you can also be overly provocative in the message that they send. And I think care has to be taken for that. But again, the history shows that we have done this on a number of other occasions when there have been times, and certainly again in the 76 incident when these two soldiers were killed in the DMZ, a tragic incident that the North Koreans were responsible for, that the United States was determined to send a very clear message to North Korea in this particular instance. And the use of these assets is no accident. That is very clear. The North Koreans know they are nuclear capable and are part of the history of the nuclear umbrella.
And you mentioned earlier some of the debates inside the US State Department about how worthwhile it was having these nuclear missiles, not as an umbrella, but actually stationed inside South Korea itself. And of course, 1976 is in the year of the axe murder incident. Is also the year where Nixon would makes this commitment to withdraw combat troops, at least a large number of combat troops from these Asian arenas. But one of the things that comes up in some of these the debates inside the State Department is this idea, and I suppose this is a broader idea about nuclear. Nuclear deterrence in general. That is, by having the nuclear weapons actually situated inside South Korea, and based on how quick an invasion by the North could be, based on the 1950 invasion, where they took they took most of the peninsula in a matter of weeks, that what you could be presented with as an American administration is this, I suppose, an incredibly dangerous scenario where you have to either use those weapons or you will lose those weapons.
Yes, and that is the beginning and the argument for the withdrawal of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. And I think your comment raises a couple of other very important points. Up until the mid-1970s, the United States actually, its formal policy was to neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons in Korea, which is interesting when you think about credibility. If you want an adversary to be deterred by a particular system, there is value in making it public that these weapons are present, and yet the United States did not do that. But as you note, in the mid-70s, you had first the Nixon Doctrine, where Nixon talked about U.S. allies having to provide a greater share of their own manpower for defense. You had the withdrawal of the combat division. You had the rapprochement with China, and a good bit of this being done without consultation with South Korea. And so you have at this point the South Koreans starting their own covert nuclear program, which the United States eventually sort of put the pieces together and figured out this was going on, and then exerted a great deal of pressure on Pak Chung-hee to give up that program. The admission finally by the United States in 1976 to admit that there was the nuclear arsenal was in South Korea, or some element of that was present, was also a part of this reassuring of South Korea after all of these things had happened that worried the South Koreans about the U.S. defense commitment under the Nixon years, that this declaration by Schlesinger that nuclear weapons were in fact in South Korea was an important part of telling the South Koreans, you don't need your own nuclear weapons. We have ours in South Korea, and those will be available for the defense of the country. Now, slowly though, leaders, and a good bit of this comes from military leaders in South Korea, start to recognize the dangers of tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea. And these weapons range from warheads for short-range missiles, artillery shells, landmines that were used, as you mentioned, to block any sort of sudden North Korean surge across the DMZ. Well, if these are going to be used for warfighting purposes, they have to be forward deployed. Otherwise, if they're going to be way back in the hinterland of South Korea, you're never going to get them forward fast enough to be able to be a warfighting tool. Yet, if you do that, now suddenly if war happens, there is a real danger that if these weapons are there and the North Koreans would attack again, if you don't use them, they could be overrun. And now suddenly North Korea has nuclear weapons. So as you indicated, you have this concept called use or lose, that if they are forward deployed, there would be this pressure to either use the weapons or get them out of there, which again defeats the whole purpose of them as a warfighting tool. So eventually military leaders in South Korea and as well in the United States begin to realize that these weapons are not that useful in a Korean warfighting context, where first of all these weapons are pulled off of frontline positions and deployed in more rear area locations, and then eventually in 1991 the weapons are withdrawn. And I think it's important to note as well to your listeners that the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from South Korea in 1991 was also part of a larger end of Cold War effort to try to convince the Russians to rein in their tactical nuclear weapons. As the Soviet Union was collapsing and coming to an end, there was a great deal of concern about all of the nuclear weapons that the Russians had deployed in various areas. So in an effort to encourage them to pull those back so that they were under some sort of central control and did not disappear as loose nukes, the United States also offered to pull in its nuclear weapons from South Korea as part of a bigger plan tied to the Cold War, but also at this point the North Korean nuclear crisis is becoming, is heating up. And so you also have this as an effort by the United States to meet some of North Korea's demands to withdraw U.S. nuclear weapons from the peninsula. And so it was a package deal addressed not only for North Korea, but also for concerns in regards to management of the nuclear umbrella, and then also the larger global political issue in regards to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, let's stay on that last point for just a moment there, because that caught my ear as you said it. So are you saying here that there was at least in part an idea in the minds of the American administration at the time that if we withdraw our nuclear weapons from the peninsula, this might assuage North Korea and maybe push them into sign in or at least complying with the International Atomic Agency, Atomic Energy Agency, or these sort of bodies that, of course, they're not part of today. So was this an early attempt to, I suppose, do what we are trying to do today, which is denuclearize North Korea, or was it, I suppose, an incidental process, something that they had their eyes on Russia and on the Soviet Union, and this was coming along anyway? Or was this a genuine attempt by, I suppose, it would have been
George Bush the first at the time to try and make an early grasp on denuclearizing the North Korean regime.
Yes, no, I think it was intentionally an effort to try to meet one of North Korea's concerns. It certainly, again, as I mentioned, was broader than that. But this would be a way, if the North Koreans were building nuclear weapons, and remember where we were in 1990, 1991, we were starting to see evidence of the North Korean program, but it was very early in its history. We're still 3-4 years away from the agreed framework in 1994 and the crisis from 93 to 94. And so this was viewed as an effort to sort of address one of North Korea's concerns, or some might say call North Korea's bluff. If you are concerned about U.S. nuclear weapons on the peninsula, and that's one of your arguments for why you are pursuing this capability, then we will remove U.S. nuclear weapons from the peninsula. And that this would be a way to sort of match what the North Koreans were saying about why they needed this nuclear program. And again, the argument was that we didn't really need nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula anymore. You also have to remember that this was coming along at the same time as the revolution of precision-guided munitions that were part of that, PGMs, and that this allowed for conventional weapons to be just as accurate, just as deadly as atomic weapons in a much smaller context, and that therefore you didn't need nuclear weapons to defend South Korea anymore. Plus, the South Korean military was becoming that much more advanced and modern as well in its capabilities. So you put all of these things together, and I think you're absolutely right. It was viewed at the time as an effort to perhaps move towards denuclearization, but as we know, that did not happen.
So as we gaze an eye here towards North Korea, because of course North Korea is the threat that brings about the American umbrella over South Korea. So let's take us there and just show us what type of threat North Korea really holds today. Because since that time, since those early days, North Korea has developed a nuclear capability. Now, of course, we're unsure exactly what that capability is, but they certainly have tested a number of nuclear weapons. Now, I suppose those B-52 bombers that I first mentioned are not, I assume, are not really a option, or bombers of the sort are not really an option for North Korea as a threat of this kind. They would have to rely on missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or a different type of missile altogether. So take us to North Korea's missile technology, because of course, once again, in 2017, this is one of the things that they were testing again and again and again. And the assumption there was you have to keep testing these devices, recognize your mistakes, and then error correct. And this is the process of developing these missiles.
Yes, that is very clear that North Korea has moved in the direction of ballistic missiles as the chief delivery system for its nuclear capability. It still perhaps is working on a submarine-launched ballistic missile capability. It does have some bombers that might be able to deliver nuclear bombs over South Korea, but also Japan. But the capability of those bombers is not very good, and so they would have a tough time getting through air defense systems in the South and in Japan. But ballistic missiles are the easier of those three, and is the direction that the North Koreans have done. They have long had a large ballistic missile program. They have 500 short-range Scud missiles that can carry conventional, and I think important to remember, biological and or conventional warheads as well. They have a medium-range no-dong missile, about 150 to 200 of those missiles that can reach all of Japan. And then the various longer-range missiles that they have been testing over the last number of years, intermediate range and potentially long-range missiles that might be able to reach Guam or be able to reach the western coast of the United States, or even more broadly into the continental United States. The assessment of some of these systems is somewhat debated still. There is some argument that North Korea probably can put a nuclear weapon on perhaps a medium-range no-dong missile and launch it at Japan, or perhaps at an elevated trajectory to hit South Korea. There is still some debate over the intermediate and longer range missiles and whether they, first of all, have the range to be able to reach the various targets. I think you are increasingly seeing the assessments slide in the direction that North Korea probably can. But also being able to put a nuclear warhead on top of one of these long-range missiles is a very challenging, difficult process. I have a colleague who is a career Air Force missileer, and he tells me all the time that to be able to get one of these long-range to reach its target requires 100 consecutive miracles to happen, and the United States doesn't always get it right either. And so for North Korea to be able to master all of the technological challenges to get a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead on target in the United States, there still are probably some very important challenges to that. But I will leave that to the physicists and the missile guys to elaborate in a better way on some of those different challenges and capabilities. But one dimension of that is the reentry vehicle, which is the vehicle that after the missile separates, this cone has to be able to re-enter the atmosphere with the warhead, detonate where it's supposed to, and when it's supposed to. They clearly have a re-entry vehicle for their short and medium range ballistic missiles, but it's not clear their long range missiles have that capability. And so there are some challenges yet that are there in regards to this. But I would come back to the notion that whether this works exactly as the North Koreans think it will isn't necessarily the issue. Does it work well enough to make the United States, South Korea, Japan, and others hesitate in responding to North Korea? That's the essence of deterrence. If it makes the United States hesitate because there's a small chance that one of these systems might work, then that may be enough to have deterrence value for the North Korean regime to be beneficial for its security.
So let's talk through two other aspects then of that deterrence. Once again, unknown, I suppose, parameters of just what capabilities North Korea has here, but two that I suppose do catch media quite a lot. One is the artillery pieces placed just above the DMZ and targeted in Seoul, and many people would assume that this would have been enough of a deterrent without a nuclear threat in the first place. That is, despite all the new technology that can be brought to bear, you can fire these artillery pieces down on Seoul and kill 100,000 odd people within the first 24 hours or so. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers are on that, of course, and there's another aspect that does come up in your book as well, which is, I suppose this doesn't catch headlines quite as much, and that is that North Korea have, in some ways, a stockpile of chemical and biological weapons. So take us to those two particular aspects of deterrence and what you make of these capabilities that North Korea has.
Yeah, that is really an interesting point, because when you look at what do nuclear weapons give you in regards to deterrence, it is very clearly the ability to punish an adversary. You can drop a nuclear warhead on an adversary to cause tremendous loss of life and damage. That ability to punish is what deters an adversary from attacking in the first place, deterrence by punishment. In many respects, North Korea already had this ability to punish the South. As you note, the long-range artillery pieces and the multiple rocket and long-range rocket systems that North Korea has deployed close to the border already could punish South Korea. The chemical weapons in particular, the biological weapons, I think there's a little more uncertainty about what exactly they have and the degree to which this is a viable program, but scary and concerning nonetheless. But chemical weapons, certainly, the North Koreans have a very serious chemical weapons stockpile that could be used against the South and Japan and U.S. bases in Japan on some of these short-range and medium-range missiles. And so again, with that capability, North Korea could punish an adversary. But there is still an element to nuclear weapons that is missing from all of those. And if you hear many of the anecdotes from exchanges with North Korean negotiators, that the line of argument that is always put forth is that the leadership in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, they would still be around if they had had nuclear weapons, because despite the conventional ability, despite the chemical and biological ability, nuclear weapons are believed to give you some much larger quantum leap, if you will, in the ability to deter adversaries. And I think that's what the North Koreans are looking at in large part. Plus, I think it's also important to note that there are most likely other reasons that go into the nuclear program. Many countries have a chemical weapons program. Only a few countries have nuclear weapons. And so by acquiring nuclear weapons, North Korea elevates itself in regards to the international power structure, if you will, as a nuclear weapons state. No doubt this has a role in domestic politics in North Korea, that it empowers certain groups that are pro-nuclear and wish to see nuclear weapons develop. And so you've got a number of other factors that are part of this, a sense of leverage as well over South Korea, if you will, in regards to nuclear weapons. So when you put all of these things together, one of the key points that is debated by a lot of different Korea analysts is, why does North Korea want nuclear weapons? I think the chief reason comes to deterrence, and it is about making sure the regime is protected by having a nuclear capability. But I think some of these other things are also part of the equation as well, but not even close to being the primary ones.
And you mentioned South Korea there. So what role does South Korea play in all this? Of course, they are the country that comes under the American umbrella. So how do they see the umbrella, and how has this relationship changed over the years? Because many people that follow South Korean news, South Korean politics, recognize that there is often, I suppose it's almost like a split personality syndrome sometimes inside South Korea, where they are desperate for American troops to stay and American protection and American military friendship in this way. But they also spend an awful lot of time talking about the need to remove American troops sometimes, or at least regain control over the joint command structure, or these, and there is occasionally anti-American protests on the streets. So how does South Korea view this relationship under the umbrella? Is it just something they have gone along with over the years, or is it something they have actively sought out?
It's a complicated relationship and a complicated answer. And certainly, as is the case in U.S. politics, that it's going to depend on who you ask. Politics in South Korea is as divided as it is in the United States. So it will depend. But when you are looking at some of these different elements, my understanding is that a lot of the recent survey data has pointed to relatively strong support for the U.S. alliance with South Korea. Now, certainly there are points of friction, and those are unfortunate as we continue to work through some of those issues, such as burden sharing and a common policy towards North Korea. But I think that there remains broad support for the U.S. alliance. I think the nuclear weapons piece is an interesting question, because there has been certainly great concern over North Korea's nuclear program in the South and what it may mean for South Korea. You certainly have some who have called for the removal of U.S. troops and addressing North Korean security concerns, but others that go in the other direction, who have called for, first of all, a return of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea. And if that does not occur, South Korea should develop its own nuclear capability, because, as some have told me, that the nuclear umbrella is fairly leaky, and that South Korea cannot rely on a leaky nuclear umbrella. They need their own. So you have a lot of different debate that's part of that. You also have survey data that's a few years ago that talked about anywhere from 60 to 2/3 of South Koreans saying they believe they needed their own nuclear weapon. I have had a lot of discussions with different South Korean analysts officials, academics, etc., when I get back to South Korea. And a sense that I often hear is that a lot of this commentary is not necessarily because of a real desire, at least I should say public opinion, that there is a real desire for South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. It is largely out of frustration, and that there's a feeling that something has to be done, and that maybe this is the answer to it. But I think that there are a lot of reasons why it would not be a good idea, A, to return U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea, and B, to have South Korea build its own nuclear weapons. Now, of course, a lot of these things are on the table, and are, I shouldn't say on the table, they are under discussion because of the current process of attempting to denuclearize North Korea. But I'm not sure we will get to denuclearizing North Korea, and so these things may become much more front and center in the years ahead.
So let's gameplay this out for a moment then, and walk this forward. So we've built up this idea of the umbrella and all the deep history of it. Now, and I suppose you alluded to this very early on in, I think, your first answer of just how credible or just how useful this thing is as an actual idea, the possibility of America using nuclear weapons in the Korean Peninsula. So is there any scenario that you can imagine in which America would actually go about and actually would operationalize nuclear weapons inside, I suppose, it'd be inside North Korea? So I suppose the scenarios that first come to mind are things like a conventional attack, an invasion, even a chemical or a nuclear attack. But through some of your work here, I begin to read these ideas that even if these attacks happened on South Korea, that maybe it wouldn't be prudent, even in those circumstances, to respond with nuclear weapons rather than just conventional forces.
Yes, and let me start with that, because I think the issue of why the United States would likely not use nuclear weapons is the starting point. But I also certainly in the book admit to the fact that there may be some scenarios where the United States decides to use nuclear weapons, but I think they are very, very small, and I think highly unlikely. But let me back up and say why I think using nuclear weapons are unlikely, and why I think they are a disaster if the United States would use nuclear weapons. First of all, stop and think about what scenario, as you suggest, it would take for the United States to be considering nuclear weapons. That is a very, very serious prospect, and North Korea must have done something that crossed a very, very serious red line for the United States to think about using nuclear weapons. If that's the case, I would argue that we are likely in a position where regime change is on the table, that North Korea has done something so egregious that the United States and South Korea are tired of this security situation and are ready to eliminate this security problem once and for all. If that's the case, you are talking about follow-on combat operations going into the north. You are talking about unifying the peninsula under South Korea control, ending the North Korean regime. Why would you want to irradiate the northern half of the peninsula with nuclear weapons prior to sending combat troops north to deal with this problem? I think from a military perspective, there are a number of reasons why that is a very unwise direction to go. Second, and also I should add to that, whatever would happen, South Korea would inherit whatever that mess is. So if we're talking about large-scale nuclear cleanup, South Korea would now be responsible for a lot of that. Second, you look at the destruction that would happen through the use of nuclear weapons. Now, certainly no one would probably have much sympathy for the North Korean leadership, but there would be a lot of North Korean civilians that would die if nuclear use were to occur. But then also consider the nuclear fallout and nuclear effects that could very easily blow south. They could blow east or west into Japan or to China. And so the countries that you are trying to protect could very easily be heavily affected by the nuclear fallout from the use of nuclear weapons on a Korean contingency. So I think that's a very, very serious issue. Another reason I think is that there would be hesitation by an American president to use nuclear weapons, even in retaliation for a North Korean nuclear use. These are very, very serious weapons. I think certainly for the United States to use nuclear weapons first, for the first time after World War II, an American president would hesitate long and hard before doing that and looking for other options. I think that you would also have that same norm in regards to retaliation because of what that would mean. And the other thing that I think is very important from a strategic perspective, having countries use nuclear weapons is not in the United States' interest, because other countries could very easily use those weapons against the U.S. to equalize force imbalances that the United States might have. To legitimize the use of nuclear weapons by further using nuclear weapons to respond to North Korea or even to North Korean nuclear use is not in the United States' interest. So I think that from a strategic perspective, it would have a great deal of interest in refraining from using nuclear weapons, even in response to a nuclear strike, as well as the normative and moral questions that would hold a U.S. president back. Now, with all of that said, the final point to this is that this does not mean the United States would not be there to defend South Korea or Japan if it were attacked. I think the United States absolutely would be there. But it has plenty of conventional options that would have similar strategic effects on North Korea, that it does not need to go to nuclear weapons, and in fact is unwise for the United States to do that. Now, do I admit in the book that there may be some scenarios where the emotion of the incident, of the circumstances would just demand politically in the United States? For example, if a nuclear weapon were used on an American military base in Japan or South Korea and killed, thousands of Americans as a result, there may be such overwhelming domestic pressure in the United States that a president would perhaps have to reconsider my argument. But I still think that would be unlikely. I think that the response, again, would be to absolutely flatten North Korea and take out the leadership, but it would not be with nuclear weapons.
What about if in that, I suppose, as you mentioned, that 1 in 100 possibility that the weapon, I suppose, and this is looking for quite an improbable scenario here, but what would you imagine the same response would take place if that weapon was not targeted in Japan or South Korea, but in fact targeted in the American mainland? So if they have a capability beyond what we imagine, and if an attack comes, it comes not on South Korea or Japan, but on the American mainland, would you imagine the response would go through the same calculations, or would it then kick into that high gear of nuclear retaliation, or would it just be, or would that same response just be restrained by all those factors that you went through before?
I think those factors would definitely still be in play, but it certainly would be a very different circumstance if the U.S. homeland were hit. And that, again, would fall in that scenario of possibly the emotion of the event would push a U.S. president to respond regardless. But certainly, again, some of the military factors, if the North Koreans hit the U.S. homeland with a nuclear weapon, again, I would argue that regime change is now on the table. And it is not about any sort of sympathetic response to the North Korean regime. It is about removing this security problem once and for all. And conventional weapons would be the best route to do that. Nuclear weapons would be extremely problematic. But again, I think that there could be, when you factor in the emotions of that response, you're right that there could be a very different calculation there. Let me just say, though, as well, that I think an important element here is that sometimes when analysts put these scenarios together, these scenarios are such difficult scenarios to get to. I always often read these sorts of proposals and then say, well, but how did we get to that point? And I think that there's an awful lot of doomsday thinking that gets us to some of these different scenarios that are highly unlikely to get to. Certainly military planners have to think about those. But again, I think that it's very unlikely that we would use nuclear weapons in response to any of these.
But there is one criticism that you bring up yourself in the book as a possible criticism that people would bring forward. And this goes back to some of the earlier questions that we had about credibility. Now, despite all those factors that you laid down there, there's a thought that you bring up that if America doesn't respond with nuclear weapons, so it responds with a conventional force or a conventional attack, then in some ways this might undermine their credibility. The idea of deterrence itself, that all the security guarantees and all the nuclear promises that they've been given over the years are suddenly shown up to be meaningless. And then this affects alliances around the world and the behavior of other rogue states. So do you see that the non-use of nuclear weapons in this scenario might actually affect credibility? Or, as you mentioned there, would the actual act of going in, destroying the North Korean military and changing the regime solve that crisis regardless? And this is almost like a straw man argument that we're putting up here.
Sure. I think that this is a very important question. And let me back up and point out that the United States has never said it will use nuclear weapons in response to another nuclear strike. That has certainly been the logic train that you can very easily draw on. But what the United States has said is it will be there. It has said these countries are under the U.S. nuclear umbrella for a number of years. But then in 2009 said the United States is protecting these countries as a result of its extended deterrence commitment, which includes nuclear weapons, conventional strike capabilities, and ballistic missile defense. The United States does not say that it will directly respond nuclear for nuclear. And so when you look at credibility, if North Korea were to use nuclear weapons and the response of the United States is in combination with South Korea and again, if North Korea crossed those lines, my gosh, the entire international community would be in support of a response against North Korea. And that the United States would, with all of this assistance, would take out the North Korean regime. You know, the United States didn't say it would use nuclear weapons. It said it would defend its ally. And that sort of action would be just as important in regards to supporting credibility. That is not an uncredible response to take out the North Korean regime if it crossed certain lines. I think that would absolutely continue to bolster U.S. credibility. It doesn't have to be a nuclear for nuclear response. It is about defending allies in whatever way is most appropriate.
So let's finish this off with a broader question then. So based on all the analysis that we've gone through there, why does South Korea today still see it as such an important aspect, this nuclear umbrella? And why do America see it as such an important aspect to still hold or still promise over the South Korean peninsula? I get the feeling reading some of your work here that it might almost be a symbolic effect, a broader commitment, as in we have these weapons, and if we promise them to never use them, it would be almost like a betrayal in the sense that we will protect you, and that is a promise no matter how we have to do that. And that is a commitment from an economic commitment, a social commitment, a military commitment, but it is a broader commitment to the South Korean state itself, and this is just one aspect of a broader commitment, a symbolic effect. Is that how you see this, or do you see it in some other way?
Yes, I mean, I think that a couple of different things, and it depends on whether you're looking at this from the U.S. side or the South Korean side. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that I think there is an important element of this as a political signal of the importance of the ally, that the United States is willing to go possibly to this level to defend this ally is a political signal to these allies. It also, again, is an important non-proliferation tool for the United States. But from a South Korean perspective, I think there are a couple of other things that are important to mention. First of all, when you talk to South Korean defense analysts, there's a very clear sense that nuclear weapons provide such a major possibility of destruction that conventional weapons cannot. This is absolutely essential to being able to deter North Koreans. That if they cross certain lines, it will be nuclear destruction, which is tremendously more than conventional weapons, and therefore that assists in deterring North Korea. It also means that North Korea cannot hope to escalate to nuclear weapons without a fear that it could bring the United States and nuclear weapons into the picture. I think there's also a sense that North Korea gains some degree of political leverage over the South by the fact that the North has nuclear weapons and the South does not. The U.S. nuclear umbrella helps to offset that. I think also I have heard from a number of different folks that I have talked to that there is a sense among South Korean leaders, politicians, etc., particularly back in the days of a few years ago when North Korea was testing regularly, and this frustration about what do we do with it, how do we address this, how do we make sure the country remains safe, that the U.S. nuclear umbrella helped to take off some of the pressure from South Korean leaders and politicians, that with the U.S. nuclear umbrella, South Korea was doing something, that it was protected, and it took off some of the pressure of South Korea to have to consider building its own nuclear capability, which again would come with, I think, tremendous costs at a number of different levels in a number of different ways. That is not wise for South Korea. And lastly, I think there are a number of South Koreans who recognize that this is an important political signal, that the United States is probably not likely to use nuclear weapons. But the political signal that it sends, not only to North Korea, but to South Korea and its people, is very important, and that it again reinforces the political nature of this. And again, to come back to the point I mentioned earlier about the Dennis Healy quote, that while a 95% credibility statement is necessary to assure South Koreans of the absolute certainty of U.S. retaliation with nuclear weapons, it may only need some 5% or a relatively small amount of credibility. And of course, as long as the United States has nuclear weapons, the North Koreans are not assured that the United States would never use them. It's particularly in a scenario directed at the U.S. homeland. And even if the United States withdrew the U.S. nuclear umbrella, would the North Koreans even believe it at this particular point, which gets to some of the current discussion about defining what denuclearization means based on North Korea's statement last year. So again, I think there's a lot of complicated elements to this. I think it is largely political and symbolic, but I don't think that means it's unimportant. But again, I think these are some very difficult, complicated issues that are part of how deterrence works in a real world context.
So that's a very good summary to actually leave this on here. So the book that we've been speaking through today, and as I mentioned earlier, we've been talking through only a small aspect of the much broader book here. So there is a lot more in there. The book's title is Japan, South Korea, and the United States Nuclear Umbrella. And that is available at the moment. I can't recommend it enough. And on that, Terence Roehrig, thanks for coming on to the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jed.